And now I welcome Professor Sabyasachi here. Before I hand over to Professor Sabyasachi, who will be chairing this session, sir, I don't know this is difficult virtual chairing, but with some difficulty, you agreed to chair this session. I'll quickly introduce all the panelists so that there is no stop in between. The panelists who will be speaking now are in and all of them are here. I see Professor Tanvir Fazal, Professor Abdul Shaban, Professor Rowena Robinson from IIT Mumbai, Professor Vivek Kumar, Professor Asim Prakash. Professor Tanvir Fazal is now at University of Hyderabad in the Department of Sociology. As we know that he was a associate professor at in the Department of Sociology at Jawaharlal Nehru University before moving to Hyderabad. And before he joined JNU, he worked for a long time at National Mandela Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution at Jamia Millia Islamia. I refer him always because of his vast writing and contemporary writing on minorities. The recent, which we see, Minority Conundrum by Penguin, Nation State and Minority Rights in India, which is a comparative perspective on Muslims and Sikh identities. National minority nationalism in South Asia, both from Routledge and more than 2 dozen very much, in fact, peer-reviewed papers on minorities. He is one of the young inspirations to many of us, where consistently his writing is showing directions on minority studies. Although he doesn't say that I do any work. Whenever we request, he say मैंने तो कुछ किया नहीं है. But then when I see his bio not available on the website, it tells the story that he has been consistently writing on minority studies. Welcome, Professor Tanvir Fazal. We have Professor Vivek Kumar here. Professor Vivek Kumar is from JNU. He is at present chairperson of we say CSSS at JNU. He has been there in JNU in the Department of Sociology for almost now 20 years. Before he worked in Uttar Pradesh and then TISS as well. He is honored with different distinguished award from nationally and internationally. He was also as fellow at Harvard and British Columbia. His recent writings and what I should mention here, apart from all more than 2 dozen writings on different areas of marginalization in Indian sociology, which I read recently, is how egalitarian is Indian sociology. In 2016, we find in EPW, situating Dalits in Indian sociology is another piece we need to read, and caste and democracy in India, a perspective from below. These three writing, which connects me to sir on minority studies, where we hope that your perspective will be giving importance to us. We have third speaker, Professor Asim Prakash. He is a chairperson of School of Public Policy and Governance at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad campus. Asim Prakash is professor and currently the chairperson. He is here for almost 15 years with teaching and research experiences. He worked at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, where he established the School of Public Policy. He has more than a dozen major research projects that involves me, that we hear a lot about his studies and doing field on urban areas, on on capitalism, and also the recent study on regulation of a small town capitalism and cities, social history, and Muslim entrepreneurs. This makes me that he has a lot to talk on Muslims in India. And we have Professor Abdul Shaban here. Professor Abdul Shaban, as many of us know, is a professor at School of Development Studies and deputy director, that we say Tata Institute says, but it is a pro vice chancellor at Tuljagar campus, where he worked. Now he is in Mumbai campus. He works. His very important piece, which I fortunately also reviewed, this Lives of Muslims in India, Politics, Exclusion, and Violence, which was published in 2012 by Routledge, Political Economy of Crime, Space by Orient, and Muslims in an Urban India, Development Exclusion by Concepts. Development Exclusion is another book which is very interesting to read for all of us. in brief, if I say that last night when I was trying to locate his articles on websites, I saw almost 16 research and very elaborative paper in only in EPW, which I have listed here, but I'll not name them. So that shows that commitment and consistency that Professor Shaban has been writing on Muslim and different issues of minorities. I have closely learned a lot from Professor Abdul Shaban because he was a member of state level Sudhir Commission, which we say it was a study commissioned by the state government of Telangana, where he was a commission member along with Professor Amirullah Khan, who is a panelist for the next session, panel 2 here. I learned a lot from the deliberations as I was a contributor to write in one of the area there. So his contribution is not nationally known, but also Telangana is obliged to, Telangana Muslims are obliged where they have produced a primary data on Muslims at the state level. So I welcome you all here in the panel discussion 1. I also have the last speaker, Professor Rowena Robinson from, ma'am, are you there? Can you slightly tilt your camera? Yeah, thank you so much. Professor Rowena Robinson works at IIT Mumbai. She is a professor, and I only know her. I had the fortunate to meet her twice only. Once at somewhere in airport, and once in another conference. But I more many of us are familiar about Professor Rowena because of her writings, and the last good volume which we always remember is the Minorities Studies in India and Boundaries of Religion by OUP. Was very refreshing to understand minorities in India. She had written a lot, and which gives an input that how sociology of minorities should be attempted. And in all her articles, I have 21 in list here, which half of that reflects that sociology of minority could be one of the emerging area where young researcher can take up. So with this brief introduction, I should be apologetic also because I will not be able to elaborate your works, but your works are there in the public domain for all of us to consume. And I welcome on behalf of Minority Studies, Indian Sociological Society, and all the collaborations here, Professor Sabyasachi. And let me also acknowledge that Professor Sabyasachi is the only panelist here in this session who has been my teacher in Jamia Milkia Islamia. So I'm fortunate that sir has accepted this invitations to chair this session, and his writings are very diverse, very plural, and in fact, we mostly know that a kind of field worker, if we want to see that, it is Professor Sabyasachi. His publication and monograph, if you have heard about unwanted aspects, normative fetish, and epistemological deceit. Interactable Conflicts in Contemporary India by Routledge, and he is a series editor with Ravi Kumar on social movement and transformative dissent by Routledge India publications. And he is present in social sciences, is largely known as one of the established field worker, a researcher who has devoted a good number of years in the field. And these stories can be heard only by the students who have been fortunate to be part of his classrooms and in the department. So, sir, thank you for accepting our invitations. You are going to be chairing the session, very challenging session, because I cannot say all the panelists to have 10 minutes and finish their talk, but I rest upon your discretion. Thank you so much. And if you have in hand, the beginning would be like Professor Tanveer, Professor Abdul Shaban, Professor Rowena Robinson, Professor Vivek Kumar, and then Professor Asim Prakash. Without any thing, but just it is there in the poster, so accordingly it will be easy for you to move. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
You are audible, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zia, for calling me over to be a chair of this session. I am grateful to Professor Arvinder Kaur and the organizing committee of this particular group I am a minority in this group because I am not a minority expert. But I have several questions as an outsider, and which I hope to learn about as the discussion proceeds. As an introductory statement before the speakers begin to give their own perspective, I want to say that the discussion so far, or the presentation so far, has given us a very good political understanding and a constitutional understanding of what minority concerns are. This brings us directly to the thematics of this particular workshop. And I read from the concept paper, the binary model used so far has failed, I underline failed, to bring necessary changes and academic vice versa common sense understanding, whereby minorities are mostly understood politically and less academically. So I hope to learn from all the panelists what these binaries are and how are we going to address these binaries from an interdisciplinary perspective. I've identified three binaries already in the texts that have been given so far. The first binary is between the majority and the minority. The second binary is that all the communities that have been listed as minorities are basically people of the book, people of the written word. And there is a binary between the written word, the book, and the oral traditions. The third binary is that we understand that all minority institutions must promote their particular language and also learn a second one. So this is a bilingual structure. But actually, if you look at the Indian masses, especially the tribal people, an ordinary tribal people at least speaks 5 languages fluently. I think this is another binary that we need to look at. And I hope to be enlightened on what more of these binaries can do, or perhaps a list of more binaries, and also about interdisciplinary perspective. With these few words, may I request Professor Tanveer Fazal to make his presentation. And we will approximately, say, Tanveer, 20 minutes to begin with. And if you need more, you certainly can go on beyond that.
Thank you. You were very generous, the chair. We were told only 10 minutes, but I'm very happy to have 20 minutes. And I'm happy to be here with other senior colleagues as well as friends, many of whom we couldn't meet for a long time because of this continuing COVID thing. My discussion is titled, Who is a Minority? Conceptual History and Sociological Anxiety or Complexity. We've got a very good beginning with some very, very important questions being raised in the previous session regarding the way in which we have to understand the minority and the minority question in India. We had a good revisit of the constitutional past as well, and with Professor Judge having a take on that. What I'm trying to do here is I would like to highlight the complexities, look a bit in the past as to how and where this concept would have emerged, and what trajectory does it take in India, both legal as well as sociologically making sense of those legal provisions. And finally, I try to see whether minority as an idea, as a question, can be discussed completely in isolation from all other competing or related ideas. The related ideas, which I would say is like ideas of nationalism as to what kind of a nationalism, or secularism as to what kind of a state policies. Similarly, a related idea would be majority as well, which we cannot wish away, simply wish away. So in a country marked by multiplicity of faiths, speeches, castes, ethnicities, geographies, the question who is a minority is riddled with complexities. What adds to the intricacies is that each of these collectivities is segmented into status groups like castes, sects, forms of worship, and regional variations to the extent that difference offsets the commonality. Identities are multiple, and each of these intersect with other to complicate the situation further. For instance, a Santhal convert to Christianity bears no resemblance to the Syrian Christians in Kerala, be it in language, custom, or the status that she enjoys in the wider society. Similarly, a Tamil Muslim has far more points of interaction with a Tamil Hindu than with his co-religionists in Kashmir and in Urdu-speaking areas. This is a complexity that afflicts the formation of majority identity as much. So therefore, as a submission, I would argue that minorities are contextually produced, and given to the recent history, we would say that violence plays a very key role in the production of these minorities. Minorities and majorities, therefore, are relational categories, neither of which exist and survive without the presence of the other. And since they are contextually produced, they also, in a different context, may switch roles. For instance, Biharis in Maharashtra, Tamil speakers in Karnataka during the language riots, Bengalis in Assam at the peak of the Assam movement, Sikhs in 1984, or discovered themselves to be minority. But in a different context, for instance, the Biharis in a communal mobilization within Maharashtra could be part of the majority, and therefore have all the safeties which a majority identity would offer in a riot-like situation. So this is a complexity which we need to be as serious. Our serious investment to minority studies, this is the complexity which we need to be aware of. And therefore, what is then important is to also unravel the context. Sociology, therefore, is nothing without context. And history, politics, the economic forces, all need to be reined in to get to understand what context produces what kind of majority-minority relations. For instance, if we go into the past, in Europe, it was the birth of the nation-state system following the Treaty of Westphalia that led to the birth of national majorities as well as the minority, those which were cultural collectives with a definite political identity, but not subsumed within the national culture. So this nation-state system actually produced minority identities. As majority cultures went ahead to found a sovereign state, ethnic groups living within their territorial expanse turned into minority cultures. Hobsbawm gives an example from history of how, at the time of the foundation of the nation state of France, quote unquote, only 50% of the French people would speak French language. But following the foundation of France, and through a project of, you can say, homogenization, unleashed by the cultural ministry, what you find is that after 50 years or so, majority of the population was now speaking French. Almost 80 to 90% was Frenchified. So therefore, as I say, these are also processual processes, and we need to therefore seriously interrogate and study as to what kind of relations emerge in different power-laden contexts. Similarly, in South African experience also reminds us where a minority apartheid regime ruled over a majority of native population. That minority cannot be statistics. There is some reflection on this in the first session also, that statistics alone cannot decide who is a majority and who is a minority. Very often we take this shortcut and try to see that those which are numerically smaller should also be necessarily disempowered. This may not be so in the historical context, and South African experience is one such. And since then, in all minority studies, there is a sort of a caveat associated with defining a minority as to not to rely simply on statistics. Another example, of course, is the Kashmiri Pandits at one point of time were dominant within the Kashmir before the emergence of separatism. And therefore, as I said in the earlier as well, that majority and minority may switch roles. And if we take from this aspect, from a role of domination and subordination, the relationship of power, then the picture becomes far more clearer that how at a particular point in history, majorities could also convert into minorities. And hence, in minority studies, we should also look into the processes of minoritization This is a point which has been earlier made by many scholars. Readily Professor Dipankar Gupta comes to my mind, who has also looked into this whole dimension of what are those contexts in which minorities are produced, largely relying on a political process. India represents one of the most complex multinational polyethnic societies to be governed by modern democratic structures. The presence of at least 1,600 speech communities has been recorded by the Indian census, of which at least 33 are more than 1 million strong. More than 300 castes and nearly 350 tribal groupings, more than 3,000 castes and nearly 350 tribal groupings form the Indian cultural mosaic. Further, the adherents of almost all the world's major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, and various forms of animism are to be found here. About 80% of the population practices Hinduism, which in itself is a highly plural system of beliefs and practices. The disaggregation of the population along regions and religions provides an intriguing scenario. They are merely, interestingly, there are merely 2.3% of Christians in the country, but they form the majority in 3 states, Meghalaya, Mizoram, and Nagaland, and are a significant proportion of the population in Kerala, Arunachal Pradesh, and Manipur. One of the most prosperous states of India, Punjab, has a Sikh majority. The Indian Muslim population, though only 14.1% according to the latest census, constitutes the 3rd highest in the world in its sheer magnitude. Given the situation, quite often the neat compartmentalization of majority and minority appears mythical. Stretching the argument to an absurd extent, a single judge bench of an Indian court, Allahabad High Court, in 2000 declared that actually the Hindus were a minority, given that they were divided into castes and sects. And in fact, the Muslims, because they were assumed to be homogeneous by the judge, were actually the majority. Thankfully, this realizing the preposterousness of the order and its far-reaching consequences, the division bench of the High Court swiftly overturned it. From a strictly juristic reading, the Constitution of India actually recognizes religious and linguistic minorities. Article 29 and 30, we are very well aware of. Professor, earlier, we had Professor Judge reflecting on the constitutional process. And we should also remember that how there is a difference of the treatment towards minorities from as the draft constitution entered into its final form. What was promised in the draft constitution was not reflected in the final constitution. However, what we retained was this Article 29 and 30, which promised some kind of a cultural protection. The reticence of the constitution makers in defining who constitutes a minority, there is no definition as such. And in defining who constitutes a minority has led to endless litigation, where they're to be decided numerically, given India's federalism, where the minorities to be determined at the level of state or at the national plane. Clarity on this account was also pertinent because, as mentioned above, there are states though small in size, but with a predominant population of religious minorities. So for example, who would constitute a disempowered minority in Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, Mizoram, Meghalaya, and Nagaland? And then in the national plane, how would this reflect? So these are the questions which have actually seized the mind of the jurists as well. And hence we have actually 2 apex court judgments which come to decide, which use both the desire for empowerment thesis as well as the numerical criterion to completely come to offer a final solution to this intriguing problem. So Kerala Education Bill of 1958, it held minorities to be those comprising less than 50% of the population. The numerical criterion was invoked. And TMA Pai judgment settles the determination of minorities at the level of state. To some extent, the relationship of power was introduced here. So therefore, when we come to studying minority, there are also other kinds of, as it happens with all concepts, what is important therefore is to, when we begin using the concept and the conceptual lens to comprehend a situation, the first and the foremost important thing is to see whether, to what extent there is a conceptual precision. And say a concept like minority, which has such a large canopy, very often, women come to get included amongst the minorities. More recently, sexual minorities, those who practice different kinds of non-heterosexual sexual practices, are included within this term minority. Again, disability studies people also sometimes tend to introduce the group of disables as amongst the minority. However, historically, as we know and are familiar, that it is the cultural collectives, particularly in the context of the emergence of nation-state system, that came to be recognized as minorities. This was also because of the tenuous relationship which the minority identities had with dominant nationalisms. In a nutshell, I would argue that given this criterion, we can have in India, and think about in India, having three different kinds of collectivities which can be included as minorities. They are, and because they are of different kinds, they constitute differently, and therefore they have different expectations as well. So first would be those which can define themselves as nationalities. Usually they demand self-governance rights. They demand that culture, their distinct culture, should also have its own maybe homeland. And Indian state has tried to address this by creating ethnic homelands such as Bodoland, Nagaland, Mizoram, etc. But this also has its own problems. Second kind of a minority or ethnic community could be the indigenous groups or tribes which seek protection of the language, script, ideas of religion, as well as the land and territory. Schedule 5 and Schedule 6 areas privilege the right of ethnic groups over land and resources, apart from reservation for scheduled tribes in public employment and educational institutions, as well as political offices. The third is the minority, which are dispersed ones. These are usually the religious groups. Also, the language speakers who live outside their language zones. So for example, Tamils in Karnataka. Because of the partition experience in India, we see that usually the discussion on minorities it comes to one way or the around the question of religious minorities, and where particularly the question of Muslims emerges as the most powerful one. If partition violence scarred our, and here again, the experience of violence comes to constitute and reconstitute such kind of identities. As I said, Muslims are internally differentiated, are not homogeneous. This is a sociological common sense, which all of us are aware of, needn't be repeated. But there are repeated also orchestrations of violence. Every occasion of collective violence, are also situations in which new identities are forged and old boundaries become stronger. And therefore, you will find that how minority and majority are also reproduced through all these instances of Bhiwandi 1970, Mumbai 1992-93, Bhagalpur, Delhi 1984 when the 6th, Gujarat 2002, among many others. Apart from that, this dispersed minority, particularly the Muslims, as the Sachar committee would tell us, also suffer from structural violence of a kind, which is like exclusion. 5 minutes, fine, thank you. Exclusion from economic as well as political, processes of empowerment. I don't need to bring out the figures now because of the paucity of time, but figures are very stark. In terms of employment itself, you will see that the NSS figures, etc., would say that out of 1,000 urban Muslim males in the employable age, only 288 could find a regular job. This compares with the national average of almost being the double. So that is the situation in which one finds the different kinds of minority groups with various different levels of expectations. in the beginning itself, I raised this question about the relationship of minority with dominant nationalism. So as we broach this subject of minorities, it is its inextricable bond with two allied ideas, equally foundational to the vision of the Indian Republic, ought not to be missed. That is secularism and nationalism. The three together form a conceptual whole to the extent that none finds manifestation without reference to the other. The minority question in India has several departures. For an archetypal nationalist, the very endurance of the subject post-independence is a thorn in the flesh. In the Constituent Assembly itself, where there were many speakers who would say that why do we still retain this minority as an idea? You know, it suggests vociferous tendencies, the term which very frequently used in those days, which referred to secessionism, disunity, as well as disaffection. So the minority as an identity itself was seen as by certain nationalists as a threat. In the early years, Indianization was the solution or resolution offered. The term largely worked as a floating signifier where the signified could not be fixed. Since culture was the operative terrain, Indianization had a range of implications, but largely emerged from the vision of the nation that was being proposed.
Last minute, please.
Sorry. 2 minutes of concession.
Okay.
So I'll quickly suggest this is the last concluding point.
Okay.
So Indianization had a range of implications, but largely emerged from the vision of the nation that was being proposed. Secular nationalist stream of thought relied on modernist framework where tradition affiliations termed primordial were seen as devil incarnates, displayed little potential for reform, and were best to be done away with. Thus, personal laws were to be abrogated, religious schools were frowned upon, religiosity in the public arena discouraged. It was an idea whose origins could be traced to the French concept of laïcité, where a wall of separation was erected between the church and the state, the religious and the political. Proponents of this version of difference-blind secularism were drawn largely from the urbanized English-speaking elite, who despised everyday rituals and performative religiosity of the vernacular. The other form of Indianization was in the supremacist framework, which found the most resounding reverberation in the writings, for instance, of Jansangh leader Balraj Mandhok, who has a book on Indianization itself. He reflected at length on the subject. Indianization for him implied the adoption of dharma by all other religious forms, which were to exist as panths. As a result, religions having the genesis made a distinction between Indic and non-Indic religions. Religions having the genesis in the Indian subcontinent, such as Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, were termed Indic, were denied autonomy of existence, were included within the Hindu dharma, although they could be seen as the panthas. The non-Indic religions were the ones which were suspect. And at odds with these two divergent views has been the idea of pluralism, which revealed itself more in the form of practice as against mere theorization. The pluralist case claims its proximity to vernacular religious forms, which were irreverent to the scriptural injunctions and formed a shared discursive space, or what is commonly called as composite culture. I'll just refer to the quotation from historian Tarachand, who records this confluence in his masterly work called The Influence of Islam on Indian Culture. As he said, that the coming together of Islam and Hinduism led to the development of a new culture, which was neither exclusively Hindu nor purely Muslim. It was indeed a Hindu-Muslim culture. Not only did Hindu religion, Hindu art, Hindu literature, Hindu science absorb Muslim elements, but the very spirit of Hindu culture and the very stuff of Hindu mind were also altered. And the Muslim reciprocated by responding to the change in every department of life. Now, this is a very ideal situation, which very often we also refer to. There is a situation in which compositeness and a lot of syncretism emerged. But however, there is also a problem here, which which we very often miss. And that is how the politics is able to actually create distinct boundaries. And despite instances of cultural exchange, of overlapping cultures, of shared customary space.
Closing remarks, please.
5 sentences. So despite that, what we see is that very often politics is able to overcome this. And there are various examples now, how the Kabir Panthis are being today mobilized by the Hindu nationalists, the Namashudras in Bengal, the followers of Basavana in Karnataka, all who were considered as rebels against Vedic Hinduism, practitioners of folk religion, and who applied syncretic practices as well, drawing from Islam and many other religious forms, but today get politically identified with the majoritarian politics. So what is important from the perspective of political sociology also is, and I continuously am trying to reassert and the point which I made in the beginning, is the relationship of power, which should be for the students and scholars of interested in the study of minorities should pay serious attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanveer. And I'm afraid I have to follow the organizers in restricting the time now. The time will be 10 minutes, maybe grace of 2 to 3 minutes after that. I'm sorry, I think we are falling short of time. Yes, Tanveer, thank you very much for a very enriching presentation. I think you did address two dichotomies. One is the majority and the minority, and the scriptural and the non-scriptural, which continue to plague us with violence. And you also talked about contextualizing, and it's very interesting to see how majorities can become minorities and vice versa. With this, may I request now Professor Abdul Shahban to please make his presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. It's really a pleasure to be here. And Professor Sabyasachi, thank you. I'm very thankful to Professor Zia, Professor Arvind Ansari, Professor Shahida, Professor Vivek, we know they are here, Professor Tanveer Fazal, and some of my friends who are also in the panel. And importantly, my teacher from IIT Bombay, she is there. So it's really a pleasure that I'm speaking before her. It's important that what actually the idea came from the panel discussion, the title. And I'm pitching on that why there is a need for interdisciplinarity in minority studies. And that is where actually the crux, I feel that largely which I see the horizon are actually the length and breadth of minority studies in India. I must say, with my little experience, that it has been largely a failure till 2007. What happened to that? Why there was so much failure? There was no, a larger movement. The academia was shy, and even the professors were not taking the students who are actually, were desiring to do, some kind of a study on the minorities. Something very important, and that where actually we need to, and given that I'm not coming from sociology as a discipline, but I heard, I read a lot and actually was trained in some way by my friends that how to look, the issues in sociology are through sociological lens. And given that I am insider as well as outsider, I'm able to see somebody who is an amphibian and coming out and see how the fish water looks like for the fish, rather than asking from the fish that how the water looks like. So this is something important for the sociology. Particularly I will be talking about the sociological research particularly on Muslims. Why I say that when I see the need for interdisciplinarity, that first thing when you have interdisciplinarity perspective, rather than a sectoral, sociological, economic, or geographical perspective or political perspective, it gives you largely sectoral lens to them. I'm also addressing through this the students who are there, so that actually when they take up this kind of thing, I think that is important to understand the diversity within the country. And that actually gives a larger lens. It is more engaged. You have to be more responsible through the interdisciplinary lens, and you may be more collaborative, and that actually very important. So why I say, particularly I argue that interdisciplinarity in minorities study is needed, because the minorities are actually some way stigmatized when you are looking from only one lens, because you are able to propagate only one variable or one aspect. And that actually remained with the sociology for a long time. I mean, critical to sociology on that, and particularly when the article I review, that somewhere they highlighted religion so much and patriarchy so much, they forgot other variables. I will come to that. And why actually that when you develop interdisciplinarity, that the limitation you may be overcoming. So I say that what geographers often, place the unity principle, and the complex and cumulative evolution, which actually even the Mridal goes to, economist, that complex and cumulative evolution of the phenomena are interrelatedness. And that is actually another variable which actually need to be looked into in the minority studies. I will take up this one in detail. A limitation principle, because there are some methodological limitation with some social science disciplines, because they do not offer more clarity on the things, and they become very important. In fact, this becomes very important for all of us. Now I'm talking about the unity principle, because if you look at because what has happened in the whole debate, that somewhere homogenization of the minorities, whether it is from the right or actually from the Muslim themselves, they have homogenized the Muslim as a community, and that actually the great disservice they are doing. And unless you understand the community's relationship with the nature and community's relationship with the immediate culture, you cannot understand. And that what happened to that, even within the Muslim, what actually it leads to, that it leads to lots of sectarianism within the Muslims, where a Konkani Muslim, for example, if you have this one, I'm just coming to that if you understand this kind of thing, then you will understand how a Konkani's mode of life is there, how Malayalam actually mode of life is there, and how the UP are actually the Bihar, the North Indian plain caste system, where the prevailing a large and a lot, why actually this emerged. Then you are able to appreciate that if the dresses are different, houses are different, occupations are different, languages are different, rather than within the Muslims. For example, I'm coming to that, Konkani Muslims largely use sometimes Bindi and also the Mangal Sutra, but they're condemned by other Muslims within. And this is where you need really to appreciate the unity principles of the phenomena, or compositeness, or cultural relationship, or actually the community and nature relationship, which I find when actually I was studying, it is very difficult to decipher from some of the studies, although they appreciate diversity, but simultaneously the homogenization project remains at large. And that is where I always actually appeal to the students who are maybe there, that remember this in the minority studies, that do not fall prey to this kind of homogenization and this kind of actually, some way looking from only one lens rather than interrelatedness. And this interrelatedness, becomes very important. And that is where the French, social scientists like Vidal-Gila Blanchet, which talked Zona DV, the mode of life and lifestyle becomes very important. And I will come to that, what actually sociological literature actually they produce themselves. This actually helps us to appreciate also, caste within the Muslims.
Last 2 minutes, Professor Shadab. Last 2 minutes for you.
Oh, please. 2 minutes, okay. So this is actually the kind of limitation. Now I quickly move to the, from this one to the limitation principle. Some of the actually disciplines suffered from that limitation. For example, what actually Heisenberg uncertainty principles, and some of the disciplines like sociology may be subjected to more, because there is an indeterminacy of conjugate properties. For a long time, I say till the Sachar committee report, there was no what are the variables determining Muslim development? And if you look at the sociological literature, there is a large of dearth of this kind of study which actually have the policy implications. The another very important thing I quickly move to, because of the limitation of the time, really the foundation of the minority studies came, the new foundation which actually I say came with the Sachar committee report, or what actually I say the founder, Professor Abu Saleh Sharif, when it comes to the, in 1995, a paper in EPW, where he tries to become a demographer, he tries to become an economist, he tries to become a sociologist, he tries to become a geographer. And that's where he tries to really understand the Muslims at different times, with the fertility rate, to the, the literacy rate, to the educational attainments, with that kind of interrelated variables, and moves on. And that's where actually I wanted to say some of the studies very quickly in the sociological literature I tried to really produce, or actually the review, I found that there's so much actually a kind of one lens, either on the caste or either the religion, and actually go on determining the rest of the thing, defining that. They are important variable, no doubt about it, but there is a need for looking for the conjugacy among the variables and need for looking at interrelatedness. And this becomes very important in the minorities studies. Otherwise, what we produce, orthodoxy within the discipline, and that orthodoxy of the disciplines come to define the new generation, which actually also look for the orthodoxy from that perspective. And the communities which get impacted by the orthodoxy, they start actually practicing that orthodoxy, because there are actually some communities who get glorified through this kind of literature emerging from, and they do this. And so this is very important actually for all of us. I'm trying to put in very briefly that there is a need where the sociologists work with the economist, and that's what actually I see in the younger generation sociologist, and economists work with the sociologist and geographer to really come out with a larger, a more nuanced studies on the minorities, and this is the need of time. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahbaz. It's wonderful that you have been able to restrict yourself to 10 minutes, and I think you made some very important points. I appreciate your concern for including multiple criteria in understanding the life and way of life of minorities. And I think interdisciplinary work is very important precisely for that. And I think we should underline the fact that if you only have one criteria, even if you don't want to, we are doing something like stigmatizing a community by highlighting one criteria at the expense of the others. I think those points are very well taken. And I think minorities is a diversity. And I think to respect the diversity, we must do everything to prevent homogenization. Having said that, can I now request the third speaker, Professor Robina Robinson, to please make her presentation in 10 minutes.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I just can you hear me?
I can hear you, but Robina, can you just move your screen a bit?
I think it's more important for you to hear me than to see me.
Okay.
It's not so great.
Okay.
If you can hear me, then
yeah, we can hear you.
With that. I'm sure that I'm going to be repeating some of the things that have been said. And anyway, thanks for having me here. I'll just make a small set of remarks centered around three points that I have noted. They may seem random, but they came up when I was looking at the very nice introduction that was sent to us by the organizers, and they seem to me to be interrelated. So one is the question of interdisciplinarity in the study of minorities. Most of my remarks, I will use the examples of Muslims because of my own work, but one could also place their other minorities when thinking about this. So when it comes to interdisciplinarity, we do know that political science was the first discipline to think about minorities seriously, and that was that came out of Constituent Assembly debates, and that came out of the nationalist struggle. And the question of minorities as defined by their numbers, numerical minorities in opposition to a numerical majority, was something that was central to those arguments. I'm going to remark on this later as to what the question of numbers has to do with minorities, or how central is it. Sociology came into this from a different trajectory, and it carved out a certain field, but the question of religion and caste was at the center of that. And how do minorities show up when it comes to caste? Do they have caste? Do they not have caste? Ritual and all that sort of thing was central to sociology. Some of the key questions which we struggle with when it comes to minorities, questions of disadvantage, questions of disprivilege, questions of oppression, were actually something that came much later, I think, into the discourse, and have been taken much more seriously by economists who finally entered this field that had not been visualized from the perspective of development earlier. So economics and political scientists and sociologists then began to collaborate much more in thinking about the relationship between minorities and development, minorities and disadvantage, minorities and historical patterns, advantage, and so on. And this is a field then in which it might sound mundane to say, but needs to be reiterated that interdisciplinarity is key. That brings us again and again to the question of how is the minority defined, and the number issue is always central. It has always been key. It has been key not merely as figures, but as a political question. And as a political question, the question of who is a minority numerically has to do with resources. How do we make certain kinds of resources available to numerical minorities? It has to do with or how much of the resources available in the pie will minorities, depending on their number, be able to garner, to get hold of, perhaps even to extract. The second is the question of power, and will it be possible for minorities to seize power, or to be able to make a real difference when it comes to electoral politics? The third question is the question of identity, of course, the question of who we are, the question of who this nation is, and the relationship of the minority to the majority in defining that identity, the whole contestation and difficult nature of this question. But I would also say that the fourth is the question of sociality. It's a question of who my neighbors are. It's a question of how many of them are there, and where can where can we put them? How far away can we locate them so that they don't come to our schools, so that they are not in our neighborhood shops, so that our residences can be defined in a way that leaves them out. So throughout this, a question of numbers is a question of exclusion. It's a question of invisibilizing and keeping away a group or a community from what is available. And that brings us then to my last point, which is referencing Iris Marion Young's ideas of the 5 faces of oppression, which I find useful to think through when thinking about what happens to the minority who is the numerical minority, but then the minority who is also oppressed according to what she defines as the 5 facets of oppression. First being violence, that the minority is the target of violence, and the minority may experience violence arbitrarily at different periods of time. So must always be prepared for violence, for being targeted, for looting and killing and displacement. The second is the question of exploitation. And I link that with marginalization, whether the minority is actively exploited or the minority's labor is actively appropriated for the privileged classes, or the fact that the minorities are marginalized into the kinds of jobs and into the kinds of work that is meaningful, and that puts them in a position of servitude, and that is obviously not a profit making. These two things combine to allow us to think about the position of minorities. The fourth then is the question of powerlessness. The question that you cannot really make a difference, that you can never have enough power to come out of this relationship between the majority and the minority in relation to the resources or in relation to the power gain. And the last, which is the question of cultural imperialism, which is that minority groups are marked by the idea that they are in some way deficient, or they are in some way a negation of key values of the way in which we think of ourselves. Their experience and their worldview is something that is not worthwhile. They are not worthwhile. The sense of humiliation and of feeling always a lack of self-esteem. This is something that is quite central in when we think about the ways in which minorities can be demonized in communal ideologies. And the whole workings of culture, the educational and socialization processes that take the superiority of the majority community for granted, and reiterate again and again the stranger status of the minorities. And of course, we know in particular the Muslims, that is brought out so clearly in a situation of disaster like we are facing today. All disasters everywhere have always shown this up.
2 minutes, Professor Robina.
Yeah, I'm finishing in 2 minutes. Have always been able to work in such a way that they stigmatize minorities, whether it is the Tabligh is spreading the pandemic, and that becomes the way you think about the Muslim and the pandemic and so on. But more than this, I think that to sum it up, what Young is pointing out is not merely 5 faces of oppression. This is basically the face of unfreedom. This is the face of fear. And for a people who live in fear, they are a people who live in unfreedom. They are not free. And therefore, they are essentially not the benefits or the charms of democracy have not reached them. These are basically unfree people. So I'll stop there and then you can take it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robina Robinson. A wonderful presentation. I think what we need to learn from her is that we need to be wary of majoritarian politics. Not only for the 4 reasons that she said, but also because the majoritarian politics also works to set the normative of a political discourse. And we need to be very careful that when we talk of minorities, we don't subject them to the normatives of a majoritarian politics. I think that's a very important point, which we need to record in our own thinking. Now we come to the 4th speaker, Professor Vivek Kumar from JNU. Can I request Professor Vivek Kumar to make his presentation? Please unmute yourself, Vivek.
I think it's 2:07, so I'll finish by 2:70.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll take 2 minutes more if it is.
That's okay.
Well, thanks, Dr. Zia and Professor Arvinder Ansari. Always, Professor Arvinder has always been so accommodating, and I think this time, Professor Zia, together they have accommodated me in this panel discussion. What I want to do is that actually going by the theme, exploring minority studies, interdisciplinary perspective. I think I would like to just make 2-3 points in this regard. One, of course, to begin with, what I understand from the topic itself is that that means that there is, with minority studies, if we start explaining, that we can say that can there be a subject matter, a epistemology, a pedagogy, and certain concepts woven together, which can be given to us as the aspect of subject matter. And right now, that subject matter is somewhere missing. So specifically when we are talking about, we are definitely talking about social sciences. And in social sciences, when you start observing, of course, I take from my article, How Egalitarian is Indian Sociology, and put it to the whole social sciences, we can ask, of course, this question, that what is the domination and which type of domination has been studied? So we have studied European domination, we have studied American domination on social sciences. And therefore, actually, Indian sociology, Indian social sciences, they are upper caste male dominated, upper caste male urban dominated. That is what actually comes out in the and what is in the discussion, and what is the level of domination, where the domination is so visible, and the domination is depicted on the number of practitioners. How many practitioners are there? The domination becomes very clear, and then actually it's evident when the production of knowledge takes place. Production of knowledge with the primary sources and the secondary sources, that is fieldwork, from where the fieldwork is conducted. Where is the locale of the production of knowledge? Whether it is really the space where the minorities live. And, when I talk about minorities, I'm taking this definition from Minor Wiener. And Minor Wiener talks about that, look, there is no universal definition of minority. It depends upon the perception of the persons. And therefore, he says that actually 4 types of minorities in India. And this is the article when he talks about Indian minorities. Who are they and what they want? And in that, actually, he tries to talk about 4 types of minorities. One is, of course, linguistic minority, religious minority, tribal minorities, and caste as minority. So if we look into that in sense that where is the locale of production of knowledge, from where the data is collected, that becomes for me very, very important. And the third type of domination is, of course, when the people start using the concepts and examples in the classroom, how the concepts and how the examples, how the iconography starts unfolding in the classroom. So this pedagogy is a question of understanding when we talk about minority studies. So on the one hand, there is a subject matter, second is epistemology, and third is pedagogy, on the basis of which we actually want to have a discipline where minority studies can be established. Now, what is the rationale of this minority studies? Why should we be talking about? And here actually I am reminded of 3 very important sociologists. I take it from there. One is, of course, C. Wright Mills, who talks about biography, history, and their interaction in society. These are 3 coordinates of social sciences, and no social sciences completes its journey unless and until it has passed through these 3 coordinates. And when he is talking about biography, he is talking about internal biography. Internal biography is that how roles and statuses are distributed in society, how people are forced to play the role. And therefore, it becomes very important that biography of a researcher, biography of a teacher becomes very important. And actually, history of sociology or the founding fathers' biography is very important. And that's why Marx could only write Communist Manifesto. He could not write a methodological tract as Rules of Sociological Method was written by Durkheim, because biography gives you an ecology. And with this ecology, you start actually looking who is your audience, who is your communicator, and what concepts will be understood and what not. So I think biography and ecology are very important aspect of production of knowledge. And then I bring actually the second rationale for having a minority studies, and that is from Berger and Lockman. And they talk about sociological concern of human being and the society. And very important aspect of sociology of knowledge is that it brings to the problem of existential determination of thought. Existential determination of thought becomes very important as far as cultural, as far as the production of knowledge is there. And therefore, coming to the third basis for my rationale, and this I bring it from Periyar-Bourdieu. And Periyar-Bourdieu talks about the cultural capital. Now, if we look the social structure, I think it's very important to look the social structure. And who are the people who created this metaphor majority? Who has created this metaphor majority? And whether actually we are able to analyze this metaphor majority, or we have taken it as a passive recipient, as a category given to us just because there is numerical strength. And therefore, I think the cultural capital and stigma and charisma, these are three very important aspects of our understanding of society. So if cultural capital, certain people are having great tradition, cultural capital, and I'm talking about the side. The composite culture, when you are talking about the composite culture, whose composite culture are you talking about? Are these actually the upper strata from Akbar and actually, Ramayana, Mahabharata, that is the composite culture, or is there any composite culture from lower strata as well? That also becomes part of the cultural capital. And hence, the cultural capital for certain people produce charisma, and for exclusion from the cultural capital produces stigma. And that's where the minority status starts emerging. And therefore, we need to take into account the cultural capital of the individuals which have created the conceptual framework to understand the social order. Last but not the least, I just want to add Paulo Freire, because he is writing very categorically, the history of the oppression will not be written by the oppressor. And therefore, oppressed has to write his own history, which will not only emancipate the oppressor, he will also emancipate the oppressor. So oppressor and oppressed will be emancipated. And therefore, these four thinkers actually help me to create a rationale for the production of knowledge, which basically tries to understand the Indian society as a whole. Otherwise, what will happen? There will be only a meta-narrative from the majority side, and that's what starts upholding, whether we study. And I'm reminded of 1966 work of Imtiaz Ahmad. And Imtiaz Ahmad very categorically wrote, if you take actually the data which he was suggesting, whether it is family, whether it is kinship, whether it is marriage, whether it is village, all are coming from the sacred text of Hindu social order. So where is that actually field work which was there to create? And when the field work people went, they went and lived in the Agraharam or in the Brahman Basti, and from there started looking the Indian villages. So in that context, I think it becomes germane for production of knowledge from a secular vantage point. Now this, I think it's 17, 2 minutes, I will take more to finish the aspect. Now in this context, that when we start understanding, therefore, the concept which have been handed over to us with this production of knowledge, for example, I take example of communalism. Communalism is always tried to understand through the binaries of Hindus and the minorities, which is not the correct way to understand. If you start analyzing the production of majority, what is the caste composition of this majority, and where the construction of ideology of othering takes place? Who is the person who constructs the ideology of the other? Unless until we underline the castes who have tried to construct the idea of othering, we will not be able to name and shame. And unless and until we name and shame, we will not be able to deconstruct the concepts and the theories which have been produced from a majoritarian perspective. Without taking the experiences of the minority, without taking the experiences of the stigmatized community, we will not be able to evolve a representative concept, representative theory, and therefore a representative discipline. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vivek. Fantastic. Very, very enlightening and very, very thought-provoking. I think what I learn is that I think the minority studies need to be liberated from epistemic captivity. And this epistemic captivity has been defined by Vivek very well in terms of people not going where they need to go, people not using the concept that they need to use, and people just following and reproducing the mainstream conceptual vocabulary. I think 4 points need to be noted here. That I think in addition to biography, I would like to add autobiography is an equally important category that we need to take into account. Because biography is somebody else telling you your own story.
Yeah, I think I meant autobiography. I meant
autobiography. Okay. I think very well done. And I think there'll be more to discuss after the panel is over. Can I request now Professor Aseem Prakash to make his presentation?
Thank you so much, Professor Sabyasachi. I'm thankful to Professor Ziauddin and Professor Arvinder for giving this opportunity to be here with a lot of enlightening discussion. I have learned a lot since morning, especially on minorities and how to understand minorities. By training, I am a political scientist, but I often call myself as a lapsed political scientist. And I will try and what I work on is markets. So, and accordingly, what I've given the title to my, a very tentative title to the kind of remarks or kind of points which I'm going to put forth. It's exploring conceptual or theoretical frameworks to understand the continuum of inclusion, adverse inclusion and exclusion of minorities. So I'm just talking about that. How do we understand the range of participation of minorities, both in the economy, polity, and the society, and how do we have a grip over it? So just to start with, if I put forth that minorities, whether you understand numerically or sociologically, a minority in the country may be a numerical minority, majority in a particular, minority can be maybe perhaps a numerically less, the strength may be less in a particular country, particular macro region, but maybe a significant majority in a particular landscape, local landscape with substantial presence in the economy. A numerical minority may be, they may be a numerical minority, but at the same time, they might also be having a major presence in the economy or a minority presence in the economy. Now, what the thesis I'm going to put forth to all of you for consideration is that the experience of this minority, whether they are a numerical majority or they are a numerical minority, this is almost similar across the landscapes. And if we have to understand their inclusion or an adverse inclusion or an exclusion from the polity, society, and the economy, we have to understand through what I call the intersection of state, market, and civil society. When I say this thesis of intersection of state, market, and civil society, what I intend to do is not only to critique a particular disciplinary boundaries as the way they have been thought of traditionally, but also to persuade scholars and friends to think about how do we understand this intersection. Now, to start with, if I pose a question to all of us, see, how do we understand institutions that intervene for the welfare of the people? And what I mean here is the state. A typical understanding of sociologists, and very traditional, I'm not saying many of you have transcended the disciplines, and I am aware of this writing, but I'm talking about a very typical conventional understanding of a sociologist would be to understand the way the state is able to push social cohesion versus social solidarity. And economics will understand from the point of view of efficiency, or the way the state does distribution or redistribution. A political scientist may look into the institutional determinants of the conflict or institutional determinants of the redistribution axis. Now, similarly, if you come to in the domain of economist, how will an economist understand the market? A neoclassical economist will proudly and aggressively proclaim. So would the rational choice theorists in the political science, that market outcomes can be defined or can be understood at the intersection of demand and supply. Here there is a problem, because we know very well that the outcomes are also determined by the access to the state. What kind of access you have to the state? It is also determined what kind of social network you have with the state, and both in the not only the state but with the market players. The third is about the civil society. Now, civil society is a domain where the political processes happens, where the social processes occurs, is the realm where the domination happens, where exclusion happens, where the othering happens. Civil society is actually a realm where most of the inclusion, marginalization axis is worked about. So what we are trying to claim here is that how do we make sense now of the kind of inclusion and exclusion with the minorities experience? So what we are proposing is the concept of intersectionality can be employed to understand the lived experience of minorities at multiple points of intersection, which has thus far been neglected in academic analysis. In borrowing from the feminist theories, we say that, in other words, we need an approach to reflect multiple points of subordinate locations as opposed to a single institutionalized or non-institutionalized cause of subordination. It is not only the state, market, or civil society as a individually they are creating a marginalization. It's a complex interaction of these three. If you imagine three circles, state, market, and civil society, what we are saying, the intersection which these three produce, that's where marginalization, exclusion, and inclusion happens. So we claim that the values associated with the ideology of discrimination, the values governing the construction of others, are present in the domain of civil society, which in turn gets reflected in the institution that constitute the state and market. The mirroring of values result in blurring of boundaries between state, market, and civil society. And this intersection and interaction between state, market, and civil societies create a unique domain that transcends the original character of these institutions, the original norms, rules, conventions which these institutions have, and produce a behavioral pattern that is different from the contradictory to the assumed rationalities of planning in the market. The state has a rationality in planning. The market has supposed to be rational in giving outcomes. But these intersection contradicts that rationalities. Now, when we say this, that we have to understand the intersection to understand the power dynamics, the inclusion, the exclusion, deprivation, marginalization, or the nature of inclusion itself, or why in certain areas, certain regions, there is an inclusion of certain people. See, when we say intersection, we also believe that there may be areas beyond that intersection where there may be inclusion also. So it's not only limited to exclusion. So why is this crucial? It is crucial. We give two arguments here. It is crucial because it gives you a interconnected argument. What I mean by interconnected is there is a value in recognizing the importance of analytic.
Professor Aseem, 3 more minutes for you, please.
Sorry?
3 more minutes.
Yeah, I'll finish in perhaps less than 3 minutes now. The first is why we are talking about intersection? Why we are not talking about state, market, and civil society as distinct analytical categories? We are talking as an intersection because there is a value in recognizing the importance and analytically contesting the binaries, which Professor Sabyasachi started with. The contesting the binaries of state and market, the binaries of state and civil society, and the binaries of market and civil society. More important to note in this interconnection is of various institutions that interact with and shape each other and often act simultaneously, sustaining discrimination, socio-economic maldistribution, cultural misrecognition, and consequential marginalization of minorities. The second argument which we put forth is why this intersection is important is because it gives an understanding or difference between a social exclusion and discrimination which has been, and social inclusion, sorry. It gives an understanding, differentiates between social exclusion and social exclusion which has been reinforced by discrimination. What I mean to say that, for instance, Rawls might talk about absence from primary groups as a cause of social exclusion. Dawkins might talk about that inequality of distribution in impersonal resources. Similarly, Amartya Sen might talk of lack of capabilities. So these may be the causes of social exclusion. But what this intersection space tells us about the power, the way the power operates, because of certain construction of other, because of certain values of the society, that this social exclusion is reinforced by discrimination. And this discrimination is at this particular intersection. The third argument which I want to give here, and that's where I will end, is why this intersection is important, is because it provides us with certain epistemic superiority. What is that? What I mean by that? The intersectionality of state, market, and civil society provides an epistemic basis for understanding the changing political economy and political sociology of minorities. The experience of both formal and informal institutions at the intersection where power operates, where political process takes shapes, where discrimination occurs, where the inclusion is crafted, shaped, and reshaped, understanding and articulating this from the perspective of minorities. This is something which Professor Vivek was also trying to argue in the end, that understanding and articulating this perspective of minorities in this intersection recognizes the experience of minorities that cannot be ascribed to one single institution, whether the state, be the market, be the civil society. Here is where I am. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Aseem. Wonderful presentation. And what I'm learning from this is that if you have to focus on the everydayness of life and the everydayness of how the minorities live, I think in the everyday, we will see how the state, civil society, and the market actually work. Because in the everyday, these three forces actually come together and shape the everyday experiences of everyone, including the minorities. I think that's well taken. And we have finished all our panelists now. With the permission of the organizers, do we go in for some questions and answers also?
Yes, sir. We can take quickly few questions.
Yeah, maybe we could ask people who have questions can either post it in the chat or they may flag off a hand raise to see if you want to ask.
If you allow me, there are some questions raised by participants.
Please. You can
Question
repeat the question and ask the speaker.
Yeah, Professor Tanvir has a question. How do you comprehend the extension of minority category to Jains in 2014, according to your conception of minority?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, Tanvir.
Well, I presume, see, there's a lot of debate about the inclusion of Jains. In fact, it took a lot of time also, and court cases, and at one point of time, the Jains were also rejected by the Supreme Court on account of being an Indic religion, etc. But they did not use the term exactly Indic, but basically the argument that the Jains as such are not separate or completely distinct from the Hindus. However, there are another question raised on the Jain inclusion among the minorities. Though they are numerically small, but at the same time, they are economically, quite influential, economically powerful. So if Asim Prakash looks into the market, he would know that these are the communities which rule the market in certain parts of it. But this is also true that the Jains in some parts of the country dominate the market, but say, for example, there are a big section of the Jains, say, in Karnataka, etc., who are not necessarily the trading communities and may not be as economically well off as the Jains which you know in North India. So it's a question which is complicated. If we go by the definition of what I am using for the minorities in the context of power, empowerment, etc., Jains may not necessarily would be included amongst the minorities. And in fact, you will see how the Jain politics has also moved around. The Jains are actually interested in becoming a minority simply so that they're able to run their own educational institutions. They have no experience of violence or even exclusion. And hence, in that case, as I would argue, that simply numerical, numbers are not so important. What we actually need to look is the question of empowerment. Yeah. I wouldn't see Jains as actually minorities. Yeah. But this is not a question which is posed to the sociologists. The sociologist's interest is actually in the processes in which Jain come to become minority in one point of time, and in another point of time they do not. That is a question which the policy makers or jurists who are supposed to answer that whether the Jain should be included or not. But the sociology is interested in understanding the processes which make Jain a minority in one context and not in another one. That's my answer to this.
Zia, I can't see Zia on the screen. Are there any more questions? Because I think Zia has lost the connection. That's why he's not here.
There are questions in the chat box. I think if we can go to the chat box, then we can see there are more questions.
Let me just see. I think those questions have gone to Zia. I don't see any questions. If you can see.
Sachi, I can read the questions for
you. Okay, Arvinder. Yeah, do that, Arvinder.
Okay. There is a question to how can minority groups protect their culture and identity in the face of increasing globalization? This is, a general question, not specifically addressed to any of the panelists, and there are a few more. I think we take question by question.
So who would like to go for this?
May I repeat the question? How can minority groups protect their culture and identity in the face of increasing globalization? Any panelist, maybe Professor Abdul Shaban, Tanvir.
Maybe Asim, since you're doing with the market, maybe you can say something on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, I was reading the questions. I didn't hear. Sorry.
How can the minorities protect themselves in the age of globalization?
Why do they see there is I don't particularly study culture, but I can, since you have asked, I can say something on that. See, there is a very dominant school which emerged in the writings of Bhikkhu Parikh and others, and which was brought to India by Rajiv Bhargava and others, about multiculturalism, how multiculturalism can coexist. But the experience of Indian subcontinent is very different, because if you see, for instance, until and unless there is a material basis, pick up Assam. In Assam, we often see some kind of a conflict between Ahamias and the Marwadis, because, or you pick up Gujarat, pick up Haryana for Gujars and Meenas. So until and unless there's a material basis of access to both state resources and market resources, the threat is always perceived by a particular group against the other who seems to be dominant. Otherwise, the romanticism of multiculturalism looks theoretically very nice, but in practice, it's difficult to achieve until unless there are institutions which can be inclusive, both in cultural terms, economic terms, and political terms. That's a very short take, which I may like to say.
Okay, Arvinder, can we come with the next question?
Yeah. There is a question, another question: how to uplift minority, especially Muslims, socially and economically, considering the facts that there are high rates of school dropouts found, especially among Muslims?
Who wants to go for that? Professor Shaban?
Yeah, that will be a pleasure. That is the question, actually. If you look at all these writing, often I was reviewing some papers and I found that the Muslims basically do not send their children, and particularly women, in Malabar, Kerala, or actually other places because of the religion. And that actually becomes so shocking sometimes that even they go and quote prophet that all kind of marriages and other kind of thing. So that is where I was coming heavily, that what actually Professor Abu Saleh and Professor Amitabh Kundu, through their research, and some of actually those who are dealing with the interdisciplinary paradigm, have shown that basically it is not that if you economically empower the community, you assure the mobility of the labor from the very low strata to somewhere through the education to the upper side, there is surely going to be the empowerment and actually enrollment. And that is why if you look at the institutions of higher education from 2013-14 around 2018, where the total enrollment of the all India level was 24% increase, Muslim had increase of 47%, almost double. Why this happened in the higher education institutions? Because of the economic growth, which actually percolated down. High economic growth, as actually the Piketty will talk about, because led by the productivity growth in the labor, they have more distributional effect. And if that happens, then the old regime and old thinking process that the Muslims don't want mobility, they don't want to decline their fertility, and they don't want to send their children, that will decline. And I think economic growth that way is very good because they are assetless, because they don't have anything else in the, 35% almost have landlessness. And in the urban areas, they are situated. So where this economic empowerment through the growth comes, I think the Muslims are going to be the major beneficiaries. And same way actually happens to the all marginalized section, Dalits. And this is happening because there is assetlessness. So the one of the important thing for the empowering Muslims, and particularly in the educational enrollment, increasing their educational enrollment, would be to really some way create a condition in which the economic empowerment actually goes to the families or actually the community at large. And I think this will be a major one. Besides, other measures also will serve. Urdu educational institutions. In Maharashtra, they have served a lot. But the problem lies with the Urdu educational institutions. Almost, the Maharashtra state, it spends almost 500 crores for education institutions, but not a single chaprasi job is offered in the Urdu, except the some in minority commission or actually educational institutions like, these are the Urdu schools where you become teacher. Same happens in Telangana. So unless a constable's job is not assured through the educational institutions. So there is a need of transformation in the Muslims, that they move to the mainstream education. And somebody was talking about the cultural protection. I think that we don't want to be protected to go to the museum. As a community, and community has to be bold enough that there is a protection needed at some sphere. We need protection from violence as a community, and all the communities which actually are at the margin. And ultimately, minorities are not produced in most of the southern global south. If you look at the geopolitics, minorities were produced because of the vivisections of the countries and geographies. Muslim became minority here, Hindus became minority in Pakistan and in Bangladesh, and they all suffer from the violence, the product of the violence. What we need ultimately, safety from the violence. And I think that the mechanism which is there, I mean, obviously the protection from the, some protection from the state, and we can move on. I mean, community can move on. So this is important. Economic empowerment is the key in a market society. I'm talking in a market society. I think that is what we are living in. Yeah, thank you.
There are two questions.
I would like to add something.
Yeah. Please, Professor Ravina.
My mic is on. No, I just want to say that we need to, there are many assumptions in that question, and we need to pay attention to the research that is being done, as well as the changes in the Muslim community, and also the fact that the story is not the same. So the fact that Muslims want to be educated across economic strata is something that has been, that we know from studies in including Gujarat and Maharashtra and southern states. And the fact that they are investing a great deal in educational associations themselves and extending a hand through these associations to financially enable poor Muslims to come into the mainstream education system and to aspire for mainstream jobs. So this is a huge shift that we are seeing in the Muslim community since the 1990s, and definitely since 2004. And we diminish by you know, simply going by some of the things that seem to be conventionalized in the literature.
Thank you.
Professor Sachi, may I?
Yes, please.
Just a small thing.
Yes, Tanveer.
No, I think when we put so much of hope on globalization and economic growth, we should also remember that globalization has also promoted huge accumulation and inequality. So while there could be absolute poverty reduction, but inequality gaps has gone in
very high.
And therefore, the communities which suffer the most will be the vulnerable ones. So we see in absolute terms, but when we see actually as a relational one, and therefore my argument constantly is that this is a relational category, the majority and minority. And therefore, in different contexts, different kinds of minorities could be produced. So this is why we need to be aware that at one point of time, economists were arguing, those who wanted to write the success story of globalization, that how middle class has grown exponentially. But when I looked into the kind of middle class formation amongst Muslims, there was talks about Muslim middle class growing twice the number as it was earlier, within a gap of say a decade or so of globalization. When you actually see it, you'll find that the impact has been on the lowest middle class, which is $2 to $4 a day. That is the kind of a middle class which you're talking about. The major expansion is in that. This is such a precarious kind of a class, lives on such precarious conditions that if there is little economic growth as we are facing today, it may go back into within the poverty ratio, you know. So we have to be very, very careful in understanding and the globalization also as a process and its impact on different communities.
Professor Sachi, Professor Tanveer added something which is very important. I just wanted to say about the middle class.
Yes, yes.
Professor Tanveer, I mean, I say that, I mean, the study by the Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo, and particularly on the middle class, $2 to $4 and $2 to $10, I mean, purchasing power parity of 93, 94. I just recently examined. I mean, that study shows, I mean, a recent study by the Mumbai University Economics Department also shows that what actually this study show, that the Muslims at par with the almost Hindu in general in the middle class. Second thing, I just use the NFHS data on the asset basis of the middle class classification. And I find still the greatest increase among the Muslims during this liberalization time. I mean, it is not that, I mean...
no, I'm not disputing that. No, I'm not disputing that.
Can we take this discussion off screen, please?
Just to say, I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that. I'm only saying is the growth is in lowest middle class and not in the middle or the higher middle.
Exactly. That is the point.
Can we restrain ourselves, please, because we are falling short of time and the next session has to begin. Arvinder, do you want to say something?
There is one. Yeah.
Two specific questions, one to Vivek and one to Aseem, I think. We should take those questions and one general question.
There is one general question. There is one question which is slightly related to all, can respond it. In South Asia, there are a number of minorities who are minority within the minority. So from the perspective or lens of interdisciplinary approach, how do we understand the identity issues of those minorities within the minorities? So if someone can reflect, there's other
two questions.
Professor Vivek Kumar, that how far minority institutions are able to address the question of diversity within minority in terms of classroom and staff room. So it's question of within the minority. And the last question to Professor Rowena and others can also address quickly, that is it appropriate to anyone to use the within quote that sociology of Christianity, sociology of minorities, or sociology of other minorities within the ambit of sociology? Will there be any epistemological or theoretical basis to argue?
Well, Professor Vivek, would you like to go first?
Hello, I'm happy to take the question on minorities. Very, very briefly, Sabyasachi, I wouldn't take that. I think it's absolutely critical. It's a very good question. I'm glad that it was asked. It's key from a sociological perspective. From the political angle, you always get locked into legal questions about who is a minority and questions of across the border and so on. But when we think of castes as minorities within religious minorities, this is very central when we think of Christians. When we think of denominations, for instance, Ahmadiyas or something among Muslims, then this question comes up. I think we need to be aware of it. We need to be aware of majorities within minorities, minorities within majorities, and vice versa. And this this can only be resolved by being ethnographically, by being anthropologically very, very sensitive and thinking about these issues in a historical framework rather than only in terms of boundaries and national or political. There's a lot to say, but I'll just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Professor Vivek?
Yeah, as far as the South Asia thing was concerned, I'm really interested is still that, this multidisciplinarity emerged only with the area studies program. Multidisciplinarities were not very popular. I think it's only after the Cold War, and especially Emanuel Wallenstein and others in Gulbenkian Commission report have directly written that how area studies were born, and because of the area studies, multidisciplinary came into consideration. And therefore, South Asia, as far as sociology of South Asia is concerned, is still we have to travel a lot to understand through different markers and through different historical and evolutionary processes that how minorities were constituted. And then actually we will take it out that how once we start talking about the cumulative exclusion, I think cumulative exclusion becomes very important. Some minorities may face actually, double exclusion, but there are multiple exclusion. There are 100 types of exclusion. And I have made the list as far as the caste is concerned. I have made the list on tribal is concerned. I have made the list minority is concerned. So you need to make a scientific actually tabularization form of exclusion. And then you start actually giving weightage to them. And with the weightage, you can evolve a different policy of inclusion. Otherwise, what has happened here, there's a process of exclusion. There are multiple processes of exclusion, but there is only one process of inclusion, and that is reservation. That you only give them reservation, everyone, and that will be fine. So I think exclusion is social and inclusion is constitutional. That is not going to happen. It has to happen at the larger societal level that inclusion starts emerging.
So I think, is that the last question that we take up, Arvinder?
No, I think we have done now. We have done only that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I close the session?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
your comments.
The other
Okay.
panelists
My closing is not with a comment, but with a question. And maybe it can be taken up some other time. Yeah, I have not read any studies or maybe heard any discussion of the relationship between communities that are included in the category minority. For example, the relationship between Jains, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and Buddhists. How do they relate to each other in everyday life? And I think we need to know more about that in order to talk about the everydayness of what it means to be a minority. I think that's something I'm missing. I have not read anything, and I don't think anybody's talked about it. Hopefully, we'll cover it in the next session. With this question, I think a vote of thanks to everyone for wonderful presentations, for very enlightening comments and discussions, and hopefully these will be carried forward into the book and also in everyday life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really pleasure having all of you. And Sachi sir, you were apt. I mean, we could not manage otherwise if you were not there. So the session went on, and I thank each one of you, and also thankful to the panel speaker for the next session who are already there. The time we thought of is over now. We will be having extra time for them, and we will be continuing after this. So with thanking to all of you, if you can, be here and encourage us to be part of this. We will be happy to have you here. We had a lot of questions to each one of you, and I don't know, maybe in gradual time, we will have to organize individual panel, individual speakers based discussion, because the question we are getting in the WhatsApp group are very lengthy, and that demands a lot of discussion, and that will be very important. So with this, I thank all of you, Shaban Sahab, Robina Rumsen ma'am, Professor Vivek Kumar, Tanveer Sahab, Professor Asim Prakash, Dr. Shaban, and Sachi sir. You made this.
Yes, yeah, from our side, Papa, from the speaker side, I thank you for organizing such a nice program. And the panel discussion is begun because you are getting questions. That means it has just begun. So you are success all the way.
Thank you, Vivek bhai, and Tanveer, and Professor Asim Prakash, and all of you, ma'am, Robina ma'am. So it's really, really pleasure to have and discuss with all of you and in a very multidisciplinary framework, and we could understand each other. And thank you, Professor Sabyasachi, for managing it.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. You had a lot of administrative work there, I know, and then you managed to come over here. Thank you so much.
I'm rushing off now. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Please,
Thank you so much.
I'll have to go, Zia, also. Maybe I'll catch up later on.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you.
I have another thing to do.
So, Zia, you're giving us lunch also?
The lunch is really,
Virtual lunch.
If you remember, Manu, lunch is due for all of you. And
we miss Jia, we miss actually Jamia lunch also, actually.